What's going on, guys? Hope this video finds you well. So I finally, and I mean finally, got around to playing Fire Emblem Echoes Shadows of Valentia. This game got kind of shafted when it came to the context in which it was released, both in general and for me personally, with the most apparent factor to this being that it released on the Nintendo 3DS just a few months after the Nintendo Switch came out in the spring of 2017. So by that point, myself and I'm sure many others were mostly over the 3DS, at least when it came to new releases. Add to this the more mild critical reception of the game compared to its predecessors, and since I felt pretty burned after buying the special edition for Fates when that came out a few years earlier, it's no surprise that I didn't jump on Echoes day one. And so the next couple of years passed and I didn't really question going back to Echoes much at all. But then once the pandemic hit in 2020, which in turn delayed a lot of games, and I'd say we're still seeing the effects of that currently to an extent, it allowed me to tackle a lot of my backlog. And while I was making a list of games that I wanted to go back to in certain series, Shadows of Valentia was on that list as far as Fire Emblem games that I wanted to go back to that I had missed. But despite all this time to dig into the backlog, the Tellius games were a higher priority for me, because I had wanted to play those games since I was like in high school. They were just too expensive to acquire at the time, and so once I built my PC in the fall of 2020, I settled on emulating them. Since there's no way for me to directly support those games financially, it doesn't make sense to buy them secondhand. Regrettably, because of the recent eShop closure, I actually never managed to acquire a digital copy of Echoes. And so the method by which I played this game for this playthrough that I finally got around to was emulating the game on Citra, which is, primarily how I play 3DS games these days, with a incomplete HD texture pack. I don't think there is a complete one out there, and so I just settled for the only one I was able to find, which, had its issues, but it's incomplete. So I don't want to judge it too harshly, but there was some weirdness when it came to emulating this game that I want to note before I really get started here. Sometimes weirdly portraits would be their base resolution, but then the next text box, it would show them upscaled. So it was like a little bit inconsistent on that front, as well as particularly in the later dungeons when you're running around in 3D, the texture for like the vignette overlay when you're running around would not be that texture, but it would be like a random text or portrait or equipment texture that was just layered over my screen for some reason and was very distracting. In addition to some weird audio issues where Citra allows you to select a couple of different emulation options when it comes to audio output. You've got HLE, which is fast, versus LLE, which is accurate. So when running the game through HLE, which is the fast one, not the accurate one, the ends of audio clips would play at the beginning of the following audio clip. Sometimes. It was very inconsistent, so I'm not exactly sure why that was the case. I tried messing around with certain options. I found some suggestions to switch it to LLE, which is the accurate one. However, that caused the game to run at like 10 or 15 frames per second. Completely unplayable, like it was just like a stuttering mess whenever I tried to run it on LLE. So I don't know if it's a problem with the particular ROM that I was using, or if it just is an issue with Citra because Echoes is a very late 3DS title, and clearly not the Fire Emblem game people most play on Citra, because most of the time when I tried to search up solutions to these issues, I would find threads about similar problems with Awakening and Fates, which I did encounter some audio weirdness in Awakening that was also present in Valentia, where if it wasn't the end of a voice clip carrying over, it would just be a random static noise at the start of audio clips, but only sometimes. So while it was distracting, it didn't end up being a major hindrance to my playthrough, though I would obviously much prefer if there was an official way to play this in HD without most of these issues. And because of the time frame that this game was released in, I would hope that it gets a second chance at some point, because the presentation of this game in general is excellent. I've been pretty vocal about my distaste of visual novel storytelling for the most part. Sure, a lot of Fire Emblem games have a visual novel-esque element to their story at times, but generally I wouldn't say that visual novels as a genre is something that I'm particularly interested in. However, specifically focusing on Echo's presentation, the music and the voice acting are both so great, which enhances what would otherwise be a stifled way to tell a story on the scale of a typical Fire Emblem game, which usually encompasses an entire continent, includes a wide cast of characters, most of which are inconsequential from a story standpoint, but still, and can even spend many years or even generations in some instances. Echoes isn't quite so grand from the time elapsed and cast size standpoint, but it's still about a continent-wide war and is able to portray that pretty damn well despite the visual novel presentation of it. And I want to emphasize the music in particular. I think the voice acting is great in this game, but the music, man, is so fucking good. It's probably top 3 OSTs for me in the series. And granted, a lot of the earlier OSTs are hindered by the hardware they were released for. I don't really find myself listening to pre-Tellius Fire Emblem tracks, just because these soundtracks are clearly trying to be orchestral, whereas chiptune games that aren't trying to be orchestral, like Mega Man, for instance, which clearly is going for a more electronic sound, I can bring myself to listen to that kind of stuff. But for Fire Emblem, I'd rather listen to the games that are fully realized in their OSTs. While this series does have great music overall, it's one of those series that just doesn't really miss, especially from Tellius on. But if I had to pick my top 3 OSTs currently, it's probably between Radiant Dawn, Echoes, and Three Houses, which Three Houses OST kind of goes for a different kind of vibe, but I'm not here to talk about Three Houses just yet. So I've been pretty vocal about my, not distaste, but maybe disappointment in many Fire Emblem stories. And so I figure this game is a good place to talk about the conundrum of Fire Emblem story versus gameplay, which I tried to touch on in the GBA video. I don't know that I did the best job portraying my points there, but I'll elaborate a bit here to kind of clarify for those who maybe have already watched that video. The most common argument I've seen regarding bad, or not even bad, but just kind of whatever, predictable, average stories in Fire Emblem is that you can always skip a bad story, but you can't skip bad gameplay. Though I'd argue, while there are certain mechanics in certain Fire Emblem games that I don't care for too much, I would hesitate to call any Fire Emblem game's gameplay, at least as far as the ones I've played, which is most of them, bad. Even if I were to pick a Fire Emblem game that I've played that has the worst gameplay, I think it's still pretty quality. And sure, there are games in this series that I prefer the gameplay of from one to another, but the core of the gameplay is pretty much always the same. It's usually back-end details like how do hit rates work, how does weapon weight work, or con, or whatever the system might be for that. How do weapons work? Is there durability? Is there not? Can you forge weapons? Etc., etc. Because the core gameplay of these games is so tried and true and consistent across entries despite those little changes, and sometimes major changes, don't get me wrong, there are systems like Pair Up, for instance, that do drastically change how the game plays compared to your traditional Fire Emblem. I don't really think you can go wrong with the gameplay aspects to really any of these games. Are there better starting points? Sure. Are there better balanced games? Sure. But this is something that I've been thinking about as far as my own tastes when it comes to Fire Emblem and strategy RPGs in general. This game made me realize that I would not consider myself to be a fan of strategy role-playing games as a genre overall. I would, however, consider myself a fan of Fire Emblem as a series. So what I mean by that is, I think I mentioned in the Tellius video that I've tried other SRPGs that are not Fire Emblem, and from what I've seen at least, most non-Fire Emblem SRPGs don't really even try to tell a compelling story. Fire Emblem sometimes doesn't seem to try to tell a compelling story, but sometimes it does, and it doesn't quite stick the landing at times, or there's some questionable elements in there. But generally, I feel like you can tell that there is some semblance of effort to tell a story that warrants the gameplay to happen. And that's what I feel is missing in most strategy RPGs that aren't Fire Emblem that I've tried, like Advance Wars or Into the Breach or Wargroove, where I just didn't really give two shits about any story or character elements that might be present. Fans of SRPGs as a genre will say, well, who gives a shit about that? If the gameplay is good, the gameplay is good. But I find myself as a player wanting that story and or character reasoning as a motivation to do the gameplay, even if the gameplay is intrinsically fun. That can only take me so far, I find. But the same goes for most roguelikes, where Hades is a big exception because it does tell a story in a way that suits a roguelike and that is actually really well written as well. But a lot of other roguelikes I've tried just feel like time wasters or distractions to me, like, oh, I've got an hour on this flight, let me pull out my Switch or my phone or like whatever and play Slay the Spire for a bit, which Slay the Spire is great, but play Slay the Spire for a bit, or One Step from Eden, and these games that I like the gameplay of, but because they don't have any story or character aspects to chew on really, it doesn't feel as much like a meaningful experience to me than a game that does try to tell a compelling story, obviously alongside compelling gameplay, because you can go too far in the other direction with games like, I played Red Dead 2 all the way through when it first came out, and narratively that game was awesome, but I also don't really have any desire to play it ever again. I think I said this maybe in a stream somewhere. I don't know if I've said it in a video, but a game that I play once and have no desire to play again is never going to be a favorite of mine. And while I can't acknowledge that the game may be good or even great, it's not going to hit that upper echelon for me if I don't enjoy playing it multiple times over. Although I'm also not the type of player to play games over and over and over back to back. I usually take a decent amount of time off between playthroughs, which allows me to kind of forget some of the more minor details, which makes replays feel more fresh than they otherwise would be if I was playing them back to back. Zelda Twilight Princess is a great example. I got that game for GameCube day fucking one, but then when I played it again in like 2018 or 2019-ish, I ended up liking it even more, and then when I replayed it through streaming it on the channel earlier this year, I ended up loving it even more, even though Twilight Princess is a pretty linear game structurally. So there's always exceptions, right? Like, it's not a black and white replayable versus not replayable, or good gameplay, bad story versus bad gameplay, good story. There's always a compromise, and the aspects to those different factors in games are going to be viewed differently by different people. There is no such thing as an objective analysis of a game, really, unless you're just talking about features that are included or how it runs on certain hardware. What may be a pro to me may be a con to you, and vice versa. That's the beauty of art in general, is that it is subjective, and that we can appreciate different aspects of different products. And I promise this is relevant, especially once I get into the gameplay portion. Dialing back to Shadows of Valentia's story in particular, if I had to pick one word to describe it, it would be predictable, but that isn't necessarily a bad thing. Where I don't mind a relatively simple or predictable story if it is told well. And as I mentioned in the presentation section, presentation is not just graphics, because graphically this game isn't very impressive because it released for the 3DS. Even upscaled, the 3D models leave a lot to be desired as far as detail and expressiveness. But because most of the game is presented in this visual novel style, which I already explained is excellently done, I think it kind of carries the more predictable or simple nature of Echo's plot. And because of that, I'm not going to sweat showing footage of spoilery sections of the game from here on out. I'm not going to break down the game's plot because it is pretty predictable and simple, and I think is best experienced firsthand. Because even before getting to the gameplay section, I do recommend you check this game out for sure, if you have the means. But I'll kind of explain how the story is structured at least. There's a prologue chapter where some of the main characters are kids, and it kind of gives you a little bit of background info. It kind of sets certain things in motion. And then after that first prologue chapter, there is a relatively long time skip to where the characters are in their late teens. And the basic premise, at least at first, is that Alm, who is one of the main lords in this game, is taking off from his village to join the Deliverance, which is trying to liberate their region of the continent of Valentia from potential oppressors. Following this first act of the game, you go to Act 2, where you play as Celica, who is the other main lord in this game, where she is going on a pilgrimage to speak to the goddess of the same region of Valentia that Alm is trying to liberate, being Sophia, because the land has become infertile. So something has gone wrong with the dragon gods, and the continent's on the verge of a war. So not too dissimilar from most Fire Emblem stories. But the way it's presented is just far superior to the other Fire Emblem games that I would deem having bland, predictable stories, which makes this game's story not feel so bland, which is good. And I don't really care to think about, well, okay, if you remove the presentation elements from the plot, then the plot isn't good. But the presentation elements are there, so I find I don't think that's a very good argument, if anyone would even make that. But I've seen my fair share of bad faith arguments on the internet in passing, so you never know. But then following this second act, the following acts allow you to control both Alm and Celica on their separate routes. And I generally liked the versatility this provided, to where obviously there are optimal strats. Sometimes you want to clear a particular side before going to the other or whatever. But I liked the option of being able to go between the two armies at my own discretion. which I guess I can talk a little bit about the characters before getting into gameplay specifics. The cast in this game is a lot smaller than most Fire Emblems. It feels most similar to something like Sacred Stones, which also has a smaller cast, but I generally like games with smaller main casts. Not that I would deem most of these characters main cast, most of them are supporting, but my point is, in like a traditional JRPG, I find that when the party is limited to like 5 or 6 characters, it allows for all of them to get moments to shine and have character development. Whereas if you stretch it further than that, it becomes harder and harder to accomplish that. Not saying that it hasn't been done, but typically in a party-based JRPG that has, 7, 8 characters, there's always at least one that feels like they're lacking in screen time or development or what have you. Fire Emblem's different because it is generally built around permadeath, so most of the characters aren't really intended to be very prominent or necessarily have character development, but despite that, I find that the Fire Emblem games that do focus on a smaller cast tend to end up having better character writing, I think by virtue of that cast being smaller. Although sometimes this writing quality is limited by the quantity of like support conversations, for instance, when I think about Fates, and even Awakening to a lesser extent. But that's all to say that I find that the characters in this game are not stretched as thin as a lot of Fire Emblems, be it the size of the cast or the amount of supports, etc., like I already talked about. So the support conversations seem pretty limited. As far as I've seen, characters can support 1, maybe 2, or even 3? I don't know that I saw a character that has 3 supports, but I definitely have seen some that have 2 support partners. So this clearly didn't stretch the writing team too thin, because I find that most of the characters in this game are characterized pretty well. Of course, you have the presentation aspect with the voice acting. When you go into the various towns, they'll sometimes give a little bit of their backstory, or even comment on recent events in the story, to a point. I can't confirm this for sure, but it seems like some characters' sound bites primarily change from act to act. Maybe there's other triggers. I forget who it was, but after completing Chapter 4, I talked to a particular character in that location who was talking about how crazy it was that we were about to do what we had already done. So that was a little odd and clearly some kind of oversight. It's not a huge deal by any means, but I thought it was worth noting. The supports don't show much character progress until the end, but I don't really mind that because I didn't have any struggles getting these characters to max out their supports, at least when I was regularly using those units next to each other. I really liked Alm and Celica as main lords. Of course, the voice acting plays a huge role in this. I genuinely think Alm and Celica's voice acting is fantastic. And this is coming from someone who isn't afraid to play games with Japanese voices if I find the dubs to be lacking, but I thought it was pretty fucking good, all things considered. Now, moving more into the gameplay side of things, this is where a lot of people would say this game falters, but going back to the point I made about me not necessarily being an SRPG fan as much as I am a Fire Emblem fan, so certain elements to gameplay in these games don't always bother me as much as they might others. My point being that the perceivably lackluster map design in this game didn't really bother me as much as I thought it would. I actually find the simplicity in the map design in this game to be not really much of a problem at all. Of course, there are certain maps that are annoying, like the swamps are definitely annoying to traverse, of course, and there are several maps that are just open fields with not really much of note, which leads a lot of the maps to not be super memorable, but I don't necessarily see that as a bad thing because the core gameplay is great. Of course, there are some idiosyncrasies with Echo's core gameplay that come from Gaiden, which of course was an NES, or I guess Famicom specifically, sequel, meaning that the game was pretty notably different from the first. You think Zelda 1 to Zelda 2, Castlevania 1 to Castlevania 2, Mario 1 to Mario 2, at least the Western version. All of these NES or Famicom sequels were pretty drastically different from what came before. I haven't played Gaiden personally, but based on how faithful people say Echoes is to Gaiden from a gameplay standpoint, it's clear that the same goes for Gaiden/Echoes. So the main thing is that there's no weapon durability, which requires some kind of limitation, right? In Fates, there was no durability, but weapons would debuff you and like all this kind of stuff. And I talked about that in my Awakening in Fates video. I didn't really care for the weapon system in Fates and how they tried to compromise from not having weapon durability. Whereas in Echoes, I actually really like how they handled the lack of weapon durability, where each character, instead of having a inventory of, like 5 things that you can hold, each character can only hold 1 item. And of course, Alm and Celica have access to the convoy and provisions in order to heal. So if a character needs to heal, they could stand next to Alm or Celica and eat something from the provisions menu. Because most characters are not going to want to hold recovery items past maybe like the first act or two. Because if you're holding a recovery item, that means you can't hold a weapon. However, you don't need to hold a weapon to do damage. Each character has a default weapon that they can just use, but these equipable weapons have various effects, such as the Rider's Bane dealing extra damage against cavalry units, but the primary use of these is through the attack boost they give, which usually is at the cost of speed, so not unlike many other weapon systems in these games, in addition to the various combat arts that these characters can learn, which are acquired by using these weapons and eventually you unlock them. Some combat arts are available on multiple weapons, but you do need to be holding the weapon that has this combat art available in order to use said combat art. You can't just learn it and then bail on the weapon and expect to be able to use it. These combat arts are powerful abilities that have various effects at the cost of HP, which is also how magic works in the game, where spells are learned naturally through level up. There are no equipable spell books, though there are shields and rings that you can equip to spellcasters that can actually benefit them in pretty major ways. But yeah, spells are cast at the cost of HP, and I quite like everything I've mentioned so far. Some players see the limitations set in place in Echo/Gaiden and see that as a downside, but I find myself liking these kinds of games maybe more when there are limitations. Three Houses I like for its flexibility, but I think about my time with Binding Blade, for instance, where I was enjoying the early game much more than the late game because of how limited your options are in the early game. Now, I guess in a strategy RPG, if it's too limited, then it almost feels too much like a one-solution puzzle kind of thing. But I found that Echoes was flexible enough, even with these limitations, to where I could see myself getting a lot of enjoyment from replaying this game, mostly from an optimization standpoint. And I'm not saying I would just go for LTC strats or something like that, which is low turn count for those who aren't aware, because by that nature, then every time I played Three Houses, I would just make everyone a Wyvern Lord, which I didn't, because that's fucking boring. But just generally trying new strats, like I didn't mention the forging in this game, where you can improve weapons but also upgrade them to different kinds of weapons. Like you can take an iron bow and upgrade it to a steel bow, up to a silver bow or a killer bow or whatever it might be. And so that gives some flexibility, as well as the first four characters that join Alm being flexible in what class you turn them into, being of course Gray, Tobin, Cliff, and Faye. Now I do want to mention that Faye is a newly added character for Echoes that wasn't in Gaiden, and because I've been so vocal on characters like Chris in FE12 and Marie in Persona 4 Golden and not liking their implementation, Faye is just not really a relevant character past the opening for me to really give a shit about her inclusion. Yeah, she's a simp for Alm, but whatever. It doesn't really bug me because she is just kind of an additional character who doesn't really play a significant role in the story, whereas Chris and Marie in their relative games absolutely do, unfortunately. But anyway, the flexibility there, where each of these characters has maybe 3 or 4 different classes they can go into each game. And yeah, you could go optimal, but for me, I like the idea of each playthrough kind of trying a different combination, because some of these characters panned out pretty well with what I ended up making them. I made Gray an archer. His performance was kind of middling for most of the game until the very end, where he became very useful, actually, because I didn't mention that archers have 1 to 2 range. They're not limited to just 2 range and beyond, which is kind of insane, because that's the biggest weakness of archers in like the GBA games, for instance, is that they're locked to 2 range. I made Tobin a merc, and that panned out pretty well. He used the lightning sword with great effectiveness early on, although his utility did definitely fall off towards the later portions of the game once the lightning sword stopped being as useful. I made Faye a Pegasus Knight, and while she had some utility in the early game, I guess you're kinda hurting for units for a while early on, but Faye didn't end up performing well at all. In fact, I think she died twice, which I felt kinda bad about because she feels like the type of character that just kinda gets dragged into the war without maybe realizing what she's getting into. But as far as characters who died, there weren't that many that I let die, and plus I revived maybe 4 units with the revival springs. I know Python died, who I revived. Faye, like I mentioned, I think died twice, but I wasn't really using her for much when I brought her back the first time, because I didn't really go out of my way to grind all that much. More so early on to get promotions going. But the further I got, the less grinding I did, or at least intentional grinding. I think Kamui died at one point. I forget if I revived him though, and I feel like there's someone else that I'm forgetting. It was someone else on Alm's side, because I think Kamui was the only one who died on Celica's route. Oh, Forsyth died once, but I brought him back, and he actually proved to be pretty useful, even when I brought him back. And Luthier also died. He was kind of dog shit most of the time, and Delthea was kind of a beast once I trained her up, and that was pretty fun. I guess I can mention other units that were very good. My Matilda was absolutely insane. Zeke, of course, was very useful, though he joins very late. Leon became a beast in the late game once I got him a killer bow. Saber was a beast through pretty much the entire game. Katria and Cliff as well. I made Cliff a mage because he looked like he would be a mage character, but Mage Cliff was a fucking beast for me. Maybe I just got blessed with his level ups, but he was easily one of my best units. Pretty bulky, especially because I slapped a steel shield on him and gave him some stat boosters, which yeah, there's the argument of, oh, if you give a unit enough stat boosters, they're going to be good, of course. And those resources could be better used elsewhere, but it didn't end up mattering. I can't believe I didn't mention this yet, but I played this game on hard classic, and it's one of the easiest Fire Emblem games on the hardest difficulty. And even though I haven't played most Fire Emblem games on the hardest difficulty, those games not on the hardest difficulty are harder than Echoes. But it's not so easy to be boring because you have Milla's turn wheel, which you would be like, wait, but wouldn't that make the game even easier? Yes, it does make the game easier because you can make mistakes and rewind and kind of figure out what went wrong, which I've already played the shit out of Three Houses when it came out, so I was familiar with the time rewind mechanic prior to playing this game. But I thought I would dislike the turn wheel more. I do think that if the turn wheel is abused, it can de-incentivize good play, but I also think it's kind of a good learning tool in a way where you are able to make mistakes and lose units, but then you can rewind and think, okay, where did I go wrong? But what I like most about Echo's implementation of the turn wheel is that it feels like a game that is very feasible without using the turn wheel. Whereas Three Houses Maddening is kind of designed maybe too much with the turn wheel in mind. I feel like Echo's hard mode is maybe balanced without the turn wheel in mind, and then they just kind of slap the turn wheel on there as an additional safety measure for players. But it feels much more like an optional thing, especially because the first two acts, I don't really think I used it much at all. It wasn't until closer to the late game that I found myself turn wheeling more often. But even then, it wasn't that frequent, especially compared to Three Houses Maddening. If there's anything major gameplay-wise that I left out, feel free to comment about it politely. Maybe you'll get a pin if you portray your point eloquently and not in a condescending fashion. But I think I covered most of the bases. Mechanically, I like this game a lot. Map design is forgivable because I like the mechanics, as well as the story and presentation being really nice. And I've already explained why that matters to me, so I'm not going to repeat myself. Overall, I think this game is really great, and it's really a shame that it got overshadowed by the Switch's release and its predecessors to some extent, because I think this is probably my favorite of the 3DS Fire Emblem games overall. It certainly has the best story, and while Conquest does have better maps, I don't like Fates mechanically as much as this game, and so I think it's safe to say that Echoes is among my favorite Fire Emblem games, alongside the Tellius duology and Three Houses. Although Echoes didn't hold my attention early on as much as Path of Radiance did, for instance. But by the end of the game, I ended up doing a pretty long session because I was just captivated by the final act or so of this game. So yeah, let me know if you're one of the 5 people out there who have played Echoes, or I guess I should say Shadows of Valentia in case they go with that Echoes moniker for following remakes, but whatever. You can see the title of the video, you know what game I'm talking about, person who's listening to this post-genealogy remake. But anyhow, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe, of course, if you enjoyed, and I will catch you guys in the next video.